Well, welcome to a new edition of Marval Live Talks. Today we have the pleasure of receiving Andrew Levine, a friend of the house. Andrew, welcome aboard. How are you?
It's great to be here, Pedro. Thanks to you and Gustavo. I must add that the cable news networks have nothing on the introductory music and video of Marval. It's quite a thing to behold.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just make a brief introduction to our guest, Andrew. He has an impressive resume. He's a partner at Debevoise Plimpton and a well-known world expert in compliance and cross-border investigations. But let me just introduce him in a practical way. We come across Andrew in many investigations with work, and luckily for us, we've been almost always on the same side. This is a reason it became so natural to invite Andrew to be part of this and share this time with us and with you guys out there. As for Gustavo and me, we are partners of the Compliance, Anti-Corruption and Investigation Department at Marval. We handle cross-border investigations, same as Andrew, of course, from the Argentine side. And you may think that the title of our webinar, COVID-19 Fraud and Corruption Investigations, Preparing for the Inevitable, may seem a bit pretentious and more proper for a Hollywood disaster movie. In any case, after our conversation today, we believe that you will realize that the title is a good description of what many of us believe it's coming. But we do not intend for you to take our word for it. So that's the reason that we wanted to give you some background information. And we went to our daily newsletter. Maybe of you may receive it. We scan the news around the world in corruption and investigation cases. And from a very brief overview and review of our daily newsletter since April, we saw that there are plenty of investigations going around in the globe. Only in Argentina, we saw more than 30 news in relation with this. Peru, over 20. Brazil is more or less the same. So that gives you a flavor of what's going on. And this is only the news. Imagine what we don't know yet. And will most likely come up later after the pandemic is probably gone. So having said that, let me just pass the word to Andrew and to Gustavo and ask you the first question, okay? Has the COVID-19 pandemic triggered new fraud and corruption risks?
Thank you again. I'm happy to jump in and get that conversation going, and then curious to hear Gustavo's thoughts as well. The short answer, Pedro, to your question is there is no doubt the answer is yes. We see it not just as being inevitable, but rather being a daily occurrence in corporate life in the region and more broadly today. There's a constellation of factors triggering new compliance risks here. And there's no doubt, by the way, that prosecutors and other regulators are taking notice. And I'll just name a few of them to get the conversation going. We see acute fraud and corruption risks in supply chains and markets as they shrink, with suppliers increasing prices and customers pressing for discounts. With natural resources, we see greater government involvement, asserting control over certain supplies, especially resources, and this greater prominence, including of state-owned companies, is another risk factors. In Argentina in particular, in recent years, we've seen the challenges of moving goods. This is often a high-risk endeavor, but especially now, where the stakes are higher with the current predicament, where the opportunities for delay are greater, and there's diminished tolerance for frictions with lives being at stake. And of course, receipt of governmental funds. The scale of government programming and contracting right now, it's vast in light of the pandemic throughout the region, often without necessary procurement controls and with less transparency than would be ideal and appropriate under the circumstances, likewise increasing the potential for fraud and abuse. Indeed, with huge stakes like these, some degree of profiteering and abuse is inevitable, just like the investigations that will follow. And I should add that these risk factors are all the more combustible in a region with underlying social, economic, and political challenges that can bring a flame to all of these ingredients.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, I can add to that. First of all, happy to be here, sharing this time with you guys, Pedro and Andrew, and with the audience, to discuss what we anticipate will be a huge topic in the months to come, which is what will happen in regard to fraud and corruption that is taking place nowadays in the future. I mean, what will happen in the future when the authorities, both local and foreign authorities, decide to investigate, right? So going back to your question, Pedro, I mean, I think that, as Andrew mentioned, there is a combination of very clear and specific factors that we know as advisors to companies, that companies know, and the authorities around the world are also knowledgeable of. So we have a high-stakes situation with regard to public health, most likely like no other situation any of us have seen in our lives. We have a sense of urgency that is amazing for the whole world, not for a specific industry, not for a specific country, for a group of people, for the whole world. Decisions are made on an urgent basis, hour after hour, by authorities, company executives, even by people on their daily lives. We have a number of new regulations. We have new regulations all over the place, right? Not only in Argentina, but also in other countries in the region, regulations regarding the lockdown, whether people could move freely or not. Countries have different approaches to that particular topic. Argentina has decided mostly to go with a mandatory lockdown and allow for certain exceptions there. But there are a number of regulations on which kind of industries should continue to operate, which kind of controls should be reduced. I'm talking about fraud and anti-corruption controls, right? I mean, a number of government procurement purchases that used to be conducted through public bidding. I mean, those procedures are now sidesteps because of the urgency. That will bring trouble as well. On top of that, we have more electronic evidence than ever, because everything that is going on around the world today is being recorded on so many different computer servers around the world that this is kind of a dream party for the enforcement authorities, right? On top of that, we not only have government funds, I mean, central banks around the world printing money like never before, you know, all of them together, but we also have funding coming from multilateral development banks. And these are the kind of banks that will look into what's going on, whether there is fraud and corruption in the projects that they are financing. We have companies in survival mode. So there is not enough time to look into each and every detail of compliance procedures and be really concerned about what may happen 5 years from now when a prosecutor comes asking questions about what we did that, why we didn't. Still, that may happen, right? We have therefore a number of factors that clearly show that there are high risks for fraud and corruption today that never happened before, that are different to those that existed in regular times, and that will certainly be looked into by the authorities in the months to come, the years to come. And most likely when they do so, when they start investigating, they will do that with a different mindset, a mindset of the future in which it will be easier to say, well, I know there was an urgency at that time back in 2020, right? There was a crisis, but still, why did you sidestep this control? Why didn't you ask the proper questions? Why didn't you evaluate the situation to determine whether there was corruption, fraud going on or not? So it's going to be a difficult time.
Yes, exactly. So we have a very we have a combo, right? We have urgency on one side and then lack of controls on the other, and this lack of controls are allowed, right, because of the urgency. So lack of controls or more flexible controls in the government side as well as in the companies. So that's trouble, that's for sure. So having said that, Andrew, from what you are seeing and hearing, what kind of new cases are US regulators pursuing in light of the pandemic?
So I think it's useful as a starting point to note that U.S. prosecutors have not hit pause. They seem very much to be hard at work, continuing both ongoing investigations as well as investigations of past conduct brought to light by the pandemic, as well as misconduct resulting from and during the pandemic. The SEC here in the US announced recently that tips are up 35% on a year-over-year basis, which is not surprising. Whistleblower tips typically go up in times of distress. Law enforcement in the US is very focused on these matters. A colleague of mine recently observed that to think about the mobilization and concentration of resources on this issue, the only parallel in recent years would be back to 9/11, where prosecutors and regulators mobilized to pursue those taking advantage and to combat terrorism in the afternoon of 9/11. That's the kind of resource focus that we're seeing. Back in March, the U.S. Attorney General directed federal prosecutors to prioritize COVID-19 related cases, and our DOJ has committed to detecting, deterring, and punishing such schemes. DOJ has created a hoarding and price gouging task force, and there are a variety of task force, strike forces, action teams, coalitions, call them what you may, of U.S. attorneys' offices and other prosecutors and regulators who have formed their own organizations and coalitions to pursue these issues. Specifically going to your question, Pedro, leaders of DOJ's fraud section, just as an example, have classified 3 types of fraud cases beyond the anti-corruption cases that are pursued as the bread and butter, which very much remain a focus. 1, potential fraud in connection with the stimulus money or contracting by governments or PPP. 2, COVID-related fraud in connection with health services and products. And these include miracle cures and frauds involving personal protective equipment. And 3, market-based conduct related to the pandemic. Our SEC likewise has formed a coronavirus task force, and its enforcement division is focusing on risks such as micro-cap offering frauds, insider trading, and market manipulation. Also, as in past periods of economic distress, the SEC is clearly on the lookout for financial statement and disclosure frauds. And those kinds of disclosure issues are areas where companies should be very, very cautious and accurate at the moment. The bottom line is that bad things happen at times like these. Regulators know this extraordinarily well, and companies need to look out and be careful. As you noted a moment ago, the actions companies take today in 2020 will be evaluated in the future for, pardon the phrase, but 2020 hindsight. And companies will be evaluated not merely on the constraints in which they operated, by how they acted in light of those constraints and the risks presented. And everything being done today to mitigate these risks needs to keep that very much front of mind.
So, Andrea, just a broad question in relation with what you said. Do you think that authorities will use the urgency factor as a way to diminish penalties or to be more lenient with companies in the future?
At least as of today, I would not expect much of any pandemic-related leniency. I think the government's made a strong statement around being flexible and cooperative in terms of ongoing investigations, understanding constraints in that regard. But there's no reason to believe at this time that the pandemic is in any way a get out of jail free card for companies that commit fraud and corruption amidst the pandemic, nor is it a blank check or an excuse for not cooperating appropriately if trying to cooperate with a government investigation, even during these very challenging times.
Yeah.
Following up on Andrew's words, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what he said. I would also say that it is also true that these are different times. So I think that the whole approach should not be irrespective of the pandemic, the lockdown, how the world has changed during these past few months. Everything should remain the same. No, that's kind of not looking at how real life is developing today. But the point is, companies should adjust their procedures and their actions to what's going on today, never forgetting that laws and regulations are still in place. All right, there are so many new regulations regarding COVID-19 around the world. But as far as I know, there has been no termination of anti-corruption regulations anywhere, anti-fraud regulations anywhere, anti-money laundering regulations anywhere. So those are still there. And like Andrew mentioned, none of the new regulations say, okay, just go this way, and if you do it, you will be exempted from complying with anti-corruption regulations in any sense. Therefore, it's all about companies taking proper time and resources to evaluate the situation, evaluate the facts they are dealing with, analyze applicable regulations, and identify any limitations they are facing, any limitations in terms of time available to conduct even more thorough analysis, limitations in regard to information available to make a specific decision, right? Then make proper records of that procedure. I mean, why that analysis was the best analysis possible at that time within the constraints they were facing. And that, provided that leads to a legal conduct, that would be enough. You know, that is the way to go. Not thinking that these are normal times, but adjusting to the current situation without forgetting about the law. Because in the future, there will be questions, again, not only from local authorities, but also from foreign authorities. And keep in mind that enforcement authorities nowadays exchange information. They exchange experiences. They have WhatsApp groups, they have their phone numbers, they give the call, you know, I'm a prosecutor in the US and I want to give a call to a prosecutor in Brazil because they have already investigated this particular type of fraud related to COVID-19. So they have experience, you know, let me know how you handle this or that. So COVID-19 brought a lot of new situations to our lives. I think that investigations on fraud and corruption happening nowadays will be another one. So it's going to be kind of a really interesting situation to see how these investigations develop in the future.
And I would react to a few of those very good points, Gustavo. As I've said in other contexts, now is exactly the time for companies to hit pause, as hard as that is in this current moment. But recognizing all of these risks and constraints, companies need to think about how the risks have changed in light of the pandemic, which they certainly have, and then as best as possible adjust controls accordingly. And this requires setting clear and realistic priorities in light of the available resources. And to pick up on a few more themes, as you were doing, Gustavo, I think that particular caution at this time is especially needed when it comes to dealings with and through third parties, especially new third parties that are hired under these tricky circumstances where due diligence may be more challenging. There's a need to focus on what can be done remotely, but not to ignore other mission critical tasks. Some things can't wait, other things will have to wait. And of course, as you pointed out, Gustavo, it is critical to remember what I often refer to as the first rule of compliance, which is document everything. Document, document, document. As you noted, document what you're doing, document what you're not doing, document why you're not doing it, document what you're going to do in the future to compensate for what you couldn't do now. And to your final point, Gustavo, I have no doubt that international cooperation in the context of corruption and fraud investigations is very much alive and well, especially between prosecutors in the region and U.S. prosecutors. That doesn't change the fact that prosecutors in the region have very much the same constraints of working remotely and access to evidence and issues around process. These are constraints that prosecutors have throughout the world when operating remotely and in times like these. But as a baseline, cooperation is alive and well. And I very much expect that we will see robust cooperation as it relates to fraud and corruption investigations, including throughout the region.
Yeah, may I add, Pedro, just one more comment to that. I know that many times people have this perception that any actions by the authorities to fight corruption are not enough, that they don't meet the expectations of the public. But believe me, I mean, we know this, we work in this field for years. These kind of actions continue to increase through the region year after year. So we don't say whether it's enough or not, but we do say the kind of investigations and the complexity of investigations that we see nowadays against corruption are so much better than what we saw 5 years ago, and I wouldn't even say 10 years ago, right? So that's a tendency that we see, that's the trend that we see, and that's something that is relevant for companies when doing business. And on top of that, particularly for the region, for Latin America, I think that there is another player that should bring a lot of concern, in a good sense, which is the media, right? It's not only about the prosecutors and the enforcement authorities of any kind, regulators, SEC, whomever investigating, but also about the media. The level of sophistication and the level of expertise that certain journalists have investigating corruption cases is absolutely amazing. And these guys love what they do. They love investigating. So they are also out in the field looking for whatever they can find and bring to that, which is often then picked up by the authorities to initiate formal investigations.
Gustavo, and let's not forget whistleblowers, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the US, they get the size of the fines, which is around what percentage, Andrew?
It can vary depending on the case, but there have been some very substantial whistleblower awards. And you can go to the SEC's website, and there are reports of the tips by categories and amounts. And for individuals who know of wrongdoing involving U.S. issuers, the bounty is a significant incentive to bring matters to the attention of authorities. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the SEC is reporting a 35% year-over-year increase in tips. And it seems quite inevitable that we will see cases in various areas flow from those tips, which again is not to say that all tips are legitimate and accurate and right. And indeed, we see internally whistleblowers raise issues all the time, and quite often they are inaccurate. And the challenge now, especially during a time like this, is to look at all of the whistleblower complaints internally and to make a decision about what level of review is necessary for each of them. At a minimum, it's necessary to examine all of the allegations. Different allegations will then require different levels of investigation, but there should be no doubt that is much better for companies to be responsive to whistleblower complaints internally and to address those issues properly than it is to leave whistleblowers to raise them externally, either with authorities or with the press, because they felt they were not being taken seriously internally. And there is a reason, by the way, that we refer to the press as the fourth estate here. It's because of the power of the pen and to frame issues. And clearly, looking back over years, the press has played a very significant role here and is also a very popular outlet for whistleblowers.
Okay, so we have version C. Then going back to your comments, what we should do, and there's a tension here between compliance officers and the business side of a company, and so we need to have a paper trail, right? It's not only for litigation, it's also something we need in order to be able to prove in the future what we've done, and many times what we haven't been able to do, right? So the paper trail is not only for the company, it's also for each one of us working in the compliance field, right? Because you have individual responsibility, not only the corporate one. So the question now, I think we should ask is, how do we investigate in these times? Because everybody's at home, or in many countries, right? You have a whistleblower report, or you have a hotline report where, I mean, can you go over there and see what happened? Probably not. So you need to handle this remotely. How do you do that?
Well, let me take on that one. I mean, first of all, I think that when it comes to the region, to Latin America, and we have seen this in the field, right? I mean, conducting internal investigations for a number of companies, it's important to realize that in many occasions, companies and executives at those companies and managers could be wrong about applicable anti-corruption laws. They could be behaving in a certain way that they believe it's appropriate, that they believe it's legal, when it's actually not. This is usually a mistake that arises because of the combination of multiple laws. For example, the FCPA with the UK Bribery Act, with the Brazilian Clean Companies Act, and the Argentine anti-corruption regulations. So companies tend to somehow try to set a standard line, which is fine, with the requisites of each of those regulations. But if there is a mistake there, and there is room for making mistakes, then the behavior will be wrong, and the recording of that behavior will only bring evidence to the authorities when they come after the company to try and set a penalty. This is really sad, because then you see not only companies facing fines and losing businesses, but also you see individuals facing potential jail time because they thought that a traditional example, that facilitation payments were all of these payments they were making. And all of that was fine because they heard and they read somewhere on the internet that facilitation payments are fine in the US. So recording is perfect. Bring records, to your daily life. But first of all, make sure that what you're doing is legal under all of the regulations applicable to your company, to your behavior, even as an individual. That being said, in regard to your question, Pedro, how should we investigate with the limitations we are facing during COVID-19 times because of the lockdown, because of the limitations on accessing information, on meeting people? Well, I mean, before March, let's say, all of us would have advised our clients that interviews during internal investigations should be conducted face-to-face because there are a number of issues that you cannot get through a video conference. But nowadays we have realized that you cannot stall all of the investigations until the pandemic is over. So provided that there is no specific limitation, let's say you don't have access to certain documents, you cannot allow for, let's say, the key individual who is being investigated in a significant case to have assistance from his lawyer during the interview. So provided that there are not these stake situations, investigations have been carried over, and a number of them have even been concluding during the pandemic. Andrew, I don't know what's your experience with this.
Let me just mention one thing. I think it's going to be difficult to tell the authorities in the future that you haven't been able to conduct an interview, an investigation because of the lockdown, when everybody's working from home. You have Zoom, you have Teams, you have Google Meets, you have all these platforms that are very popular now, where people are interacting all the time to do their daily work. Why not having an interview, right?
So the way I see it, Pedro and Gustavo, is it starts with a realistic appraisal of resource constraints and a decision about what must happen now and then what either shouldn't happen now or can't happen now. And there needs to be a prioritization among different types of allegations. If allegations of wrongdoing are serious and involve ongoing misconduct, investigation in some form likely cannot wait. Unless there is regulatory scrutiny of particular allegations that are related to the past, then limited compliance resources in the current circumstances can potentially be allocated in that direction. And in severely resource-constrained circumstances, priority often should be given to stopping current misconduct. Then the question is how to do it. In any investigation, we're thinking about the documents, we're thinking about the financial data, we're thinking about interviews, and the sequencing of how that gets done when working remotely is critically important. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You need to think it through. Some documents can be grabbed remotely, others cannot. There are risks around documents being destroyed and giving advance notice, and the ability to image a phone right now remotely versus in person. There are elements of digital data that are quite friendly with working remotely. There are others that are not. Likewise, when it comes to interviews, as Pedro noted, there are certain kinds of interviews that work perfectly on Zoom and Teams and WebEx and other platforms. Indeed, we've been doing interviews through these kinds of platforms since long before the pandemic. However, there are other types of interviews that are extremely sensitive, that involve building rapport with a new person, which is harder to do remotely and virtually. There are situations where credibility determination is extremely important, where it's harder to do that across the screen. There are circumstances where the interviewee doesn't have a quiet and secure and private environment, or necessarily even the technical capabilities to have that sensitive conversation. And look, notwithstanding the brilliance of these platforms, the truth is that document-based interviews are more challenging virtually, especially in certain circumstances. So all of these factors need to be considered, and sequencing is very important. There are things that can be done now and things that will be easier to do in the future as we begin to open up, and we are going to begin to open up. The other thing I would say along those lines is one of the things we do regularly is partner with the very best local counsel like both of you. And the reality is that different regions and countries and cities are going to open up in different phases. And there's going to be an even greater need to collaborate with counsel in different jurisdictions who potentially can be in the room 6 feet away, wearing a mask in a socially distanced way with an interviewee. And as that becomes possible, it will make more conceivably doable from an investigative perspective. And it's just critical to recognize that different regions will come online in different sequence and order. And as those resources become available, there will be greater opportunity to conduct overdue and necessary investigations.
Sorry. Going back to what we said before, you just said, if we believe that it's advisable to conduct an interview or to have a review of documents, then we need to record it. We need to make evidence of that, why we are not doing it today and why it's advisable to do it maybe when the lockdown is over, right? And have that paper trail well kept all the time. But it's about time. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to ask Andrew another question in relation with the recent DOJ's memo on evaluating compliance programs. Since this is so important, particularly today, what's new on that front?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Pedro. You know, what's new under the sun when it comes to compliance, right? It's hard to say. The guidance itself contains no radical changes, but there are valuable insights that should be heeded when thinking about compliance programs and the rising expectations that regulators have for these programs. I'll highlight just a few of the points that I thought were most significant. One, DOJ has doubled down on risk assessments. One size definitely does not fit all. Two, greater emphasis on the adequacy of compliance resources, which is all the more noteworthy given our earlier conversation about constraints in a pandemic. Three, the ability to increase leveraging data in designing, implementing, and operationalizing a compliance program. And this is perhaps one of the most important and significant points. Four, the reality that a compliance program is not static. It must be reviewed and enhanced over time. Five, and this is not particularly new, but it is underscored, vigilance in overseeing third-party agents for the reasons we discussed earlier. And last, focusing on the importance, again, not just on transactional due diligence in M&A, but on timely and orderly integration of acquired entities. And I just want to note about these various points, what should be very clear to everybody watching, which is that regulators, including DOJ, continue raising the bar on what they expect of corporate compliance programs. Particularly in the wake of COVID-19, this is going to prove a challenge for some companies, but it is also clear to me that never has compliance been more important than it is today.
Gustavo, do you want to mention something in relation with our compliance programs and what the Anti-Corruption Office has said about that?
Yeah, I should say that the guidelines issued by the Anti-Corruption Office in Argentina are quite in line with what the DOJ has said in the past, and indeed with this new version that, as you said, is not a radical change, but it has some improvements. I also think that, in Andrew's words, we could identify one more situation in which whatever is going on nowadays at the companies will be under scrutiny in the future, which is M&A deals. So whomever is thinking, well, we should not be that much concerned because the local authorities do not investigate that much, and if they do, they take a lot of time or this or that. Well, I mean, other than that, you have the media, as I mentioned. And other than that, you have future potential investors who, if they come to get some equity to your company, if they try to even think about buying some debt securities from a company, they will look into this kind of compliance due diligence. And these are conducted more thoroughly each and every year. So it's kind of standard nowadays in M&A deals to have this compliance due diligence. And that also applies to any financing coming through, I mean, I would say even from regular commercial banks, but on top of that, and more especially from multilateral development banks, who are expected to play a huge role in somehow assisting the economy to recover in Latin America. So that's also a very important point to keep in mind. I mean, it's not only about the courts coming after people to put them in jail for corruption. It's a lot about the possibility of doing future business with the government, with these investors, with these multilateral banks. I mean, all of that comes down to compliance, due diligence, and compliance with the law in the end.
I just want to pick up on that for a moment, Gustavo, because I think you've hit on something that's critically important, especially during a pandemic. Compliance is often viewed as a cost center of a business, and therefore can be among the first to suffer casualties, especially during lean times. But it's also true that during lean times, problems are all the more likely, and this is precisely when more is needed. Therefore, as I often say, it is critical to embrace compliance as a business advantage and a source of value. And M&A is a perfect example where the prospect of buying a corruption problem unknowingly is extremely unattractive to nearly all companies for financial and commercial reasons. And compliance due diligence can be a critical tool in getting the value and appropriateness of a deal down, separate and apart from issues around successor liability and costs of investigations and potential penalties. So we can use this moment perhaps to recognize the broader role and the value that good compliance work can bring to a company, even during and perhaps especially during challenging times like these.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Gustavo. The idea was to have a 45 minutes only, okay, in order to make it short, so everybody can use this 45 minutes out of their time and daily lives, always in the same place, I would say. We have a number of questions from the audience. It's a pity we haven't been able to address them, but we might get back to you guys and answer them offline. Thank you, everybody. Andrew, Gustavo, any last words before we finish?
Gustavo, do you want to go ahead, or I'm happy to jump in?
I would just say that, I mean, as a final message, there should be a good explanation for any actions taken by companies nowadays. And that explanation should meet current facts, should be in line with current facts, with the limitations that companies are facing, but should also be in line with applicable laws and regulations. So if you are confident that you have those explanations that are sound, record those explanations and feel comfortable if anybody comes asking questions into the future. Otherwise, you may be in a tough spot.
So I've been reflecting a lot on lessons from the pandemic thus far from a compliance perspective, and just want to offer 3 thoughts on ways in which compliance may change or companies may change their approaches given experience in the pandemic. 1, I think we are going to see more initiatives around the digitization of corporate records, fueled in part by challenges experienced in the work from home era, but also recognizing how access to that kind of data can fuel compliance efforts in the future. 2, and particularly encouraging note, I see companies thinking more creatively and proactively about how to leverage data in their compliance programs, very much along the lines of the DOJ guidance that I mentioned a moment ago. And I think we're going to see more here, and that there is tremendous potential to leverage data. Some companies have begun to achieve, but there's so much more out there, and we're going to see an evolution. 3rd and last, we're not putting out compliance fires stemming from the pandemic. I do think that the work from home era lends itself quite nicely to an opportunity for compliance introspection and provides a valuable and different window into evaluating the strengths and the weaknesses of a compliance program and to plan for post-pandemic enhancements. And we're seeing many companies now going through that exercise. And I believe it is a good exercise, again, resource permitting, for all companies to consider at this moment. So thank you to Marval, to Pedro and Gustavo for inviting me. It is always a pleasure to collaborate with both of you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gustavo. And thank you to the audience. We will have a new Marval Live Talks very soon, probably in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned. Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.